With us, I'm honored to have David Raccuglia. He is the founder of American Crew, as well as a world-renowned photographer. If you haven't seen his portfolio, just Google the man, and you'll be blown away by all the images that he's taken and some of my all-time heroes. So please give a warm applause to David.
Am I on? Perfect. Hello, everyone. This is a first for me, talking to students of music, or potential music stars in their rights, and it's very exciting for me to be able to talk to you, because music and the arts is really what inspires fashion and style. If you think about my little presentation, I whipped together something sort of academic. I don't normally do things like this, so I was excited to put together something to show sort of how I think and how American Crew has, takes grooming and where we came from. If you think about music makes an artist and style makes an icon, that what we're talking about is the music industry, probably more than any other art, has inspired fashion and hair. Hair is sort of the signature style of music. It separates genres of music. Would you agree with that? If you think about going back to the past, people are considered metal bands for their hair. They're hairspray bands. There was grunge. These are all sort of genres that have completely reshaped the world, and their fashion, their style, where they were from, became a genre that moved everything. You think about going back to the 20s. I'd like to go that far back, and then we'll get through this pretty quick. Hair was very, very, very stylish on men, incredibly stylish. They had volume, they had their hair slicked back, they had shape, they parted it in the center, they parted it on the sides. You go quick into the 30s and things started to groom a little heavier. It got tighter and tighter. And then the 40s, it was loosening up again, and we were taking a little bit of the oil out of the hair. But yet, you see these trends just sort of going in and out. But in the 50s, Elvis changed everything. It just sort of all hell broke loose hair-wise. His pompadour, which was basically inspired from an African American's hair. It wasn't something that normal white boys from Tennessee would wear. He was from Mississippi. And the way he did it was very authentic to himself, because he couldn't find hair product to use, so he would use Vaseline on his hair. And he would just, he didn't really have a haircut. The reason his shape sort of all went the way it was based on just taking Vaseline and forcing hair into a shape. And it was sort of reminiscent of the pompadour of, the word pompadour comes from French royalty. It's not an American term. So Elvis's pompadour became his signature. It's what he led with in his style. And you can't even consider looking at a hairstyle like that today without paying homage to him, because he wore it so well. And if you think about it, up into the 50s, something very unique was going on in men's hair. Hair had never touched the top of an ear on a man. So if you think you want to go back to maybe turn of the century, men had never sort of let hair actually reach their ear. And in the 1960s, a band called the Beatles came to America, played on the Ed Sullivan Show, had longer hair. They had mops of hair, they were called. And from that point on, hair has never recovered. It is not recovered. We sit in a room full of cool-looking young people that are benefiting from all of this as far as style. Why do I say benefit? Because a man now doesn't have to be forced into a hairstyle. They did in the 20s. They did in the 30s. They did in the 40s. Elvis kind of broke the mold in the 50s and gave rock and roll. It's funny, if you look back at old 50s photos, Rock and roll and boxers were the two coolest people. Boxers always had amazing hair in the 40s and 50s. I think they liked to get punched and then the hair would move. There was something sort of cool about that. Then came the Beatles. And in the 60s, it really made the men's style change. So what happened? All kinds of things happened from there. We had Vietnam, anti-government. We had all kinds of changes in America, change that brought musicians to the streets. They grew their hair out. They wore colorful clothes. They looked crazy. They didn't want to look like, they did anything they could to not look like the military. Military had short hair and they wore green clothes. So what did the youth of America, the artists of America do? They rebelled. They grew their hair long. They had music that was very different. It was very different than the Beatles. The Beatles became protest. They became part of it. So you look at what happened in the 60s, and I like this stuff because I love style and I'm in the hair industry. But as far as musicians, it's amazing to know that, this is where it all begins. This is where it starts. Artists have the ability to look different. You get into the arts to be creative, to live a creative life, but understand that it's all part of being an artist. Style. Nobody should force you into any style. It's your style. But you have the ability to wear it on your sleeve. And I love that. That's an important part of being a musician. It's funny, a really talented musician must look at musicians who are really stylistic and average and sometimes wonder, that's not what I want to be, right? You take a pure approach. I understand that. But at the same time, your ability, your art changes the world. Your style changes the world. It's all part of the package. So I want to move fast through this era. We need to catch up to where we are today. So again, the 60s, you started seeing it grow. We went into the 70s. And the 70s was a very interesting time for fashion and hair. As I said, it was probably the only time in history that every man grew their hair. Like, it was almost, I would say, unless you were in the army or in the military, you had longer hair. It became such a thing. Joe Namath, as a football player, had hair sticking out of the back of his helmet. It was the first time ever that a sports celebrity actually had a shock of hair. The world has changed, and why is hair important? Because it was sort of the FU to the establishment, and that's why people grew their hair out. They were artists. It was a little bit of a rebellion. So that's going through the 70s. The Ramones, one of my favorites, were also a very influential band. They took sort of growing their hair out into sort of an anti-hair look. You can see where it all went. And then we hit the 80s. The 80s is very, very interesting when you look at style and fashion. What happened in the 80s is it merged. Clothing, art school, fashion, it all sort of came running together. It was the first time that, you saw a lot of these bands from England wearing suits on stage. It was sort of a nod back to performance in a different way. And, I found that to be very, very interesting in the study. It was an era that I was living in London at the time. London was where most of what was happened in the 80s. So you saw a lot of English bands. MTV became very popular. 1981, I believe, MTV was launched. That also changed the world of music. It brought a visual element and a performance element that the radio didn't, right? Everyone, it changed everything. Live performances were always very special, but to see your favorite artist or your favorite band on TV in very stylistic ways, that most good directors in the 90s were video directors in the 80s, movie directors. David Lynch, David Lynch was one of them. David Fincher also did Nine Inch Nail videos. That was what made him. That was made his medium, was merging music and film because of MTV. So another art completely changed the world, and changing the world of fashion, changing the world of hair and grooming. Some more 80s influences. You know, it got to the point in the late 80s where the metal bands and the hairspray bands became an incredibly popular culture, that it got to the point we knew that would crash and burn. But when you think about it, what came out of it was amazing. Because once all the hairspray bands it all died down, one of the biggest fashion and hair influences that came in the early 90s was the grunge scene from Seattle, which I don't believe the world's ever recovered from, really. I think that whole sort of coffee house way of playing music, way of dressing, way of feeling from the Pacific Northwest was so relevant and authentic that it became a pretty strong path. Now, I'm not talking about music as much here because culturally there's so much more that happened in music. When you think about rap and hip hop and all of the different styles that came with that, you know, it just crashed in the early 90s. It just sort of came out and it all came together. And the nice thing about grunge that I feel, this is when I started American Crew in 1990, the grooming products. And it was a time where men were cutting off the hairspray band hair. They were going back to classic grooming. They were starting to think about, like, you know, they like style in a much different way. And I was very influenced by this as a hairdresser. I lived in London through the 80s, and when I moved back to America in the early 90s, I saw this coming. I saw that the unisex look that was going on, because it was very unisex at that time. You know, everybody went to a hair salon. Their barbershops had completely died. There actually was very few left. And so starting in 1994, I got on this bandwagon of promoting the barbering industry, the barbering as a craft, and that's been what American Crew has done for a long time. And now it's taken a long time. It didn't come fast. You know, here we are 23 years later, and the barbering community is a very, very big community again. You're starting to see barbershops pop up in every neighborhood. I love it. It's like a new craft is born again, and it's working very well. But to move back and move out of style very fast, going back through the 90s part, when American Crew first started in the 90s, one of the things I wanted to show was there was sort of a melting pot of all of these different ideals and you know, things that have sort of all came together now. In the early 90s, it was okay to have really long hair. It was okay, you know. So when you talk to youth about moving fast through decades, I always find it interesting because you never think you'll change. But knowing history in this sort of way, I think it's very important. You know, you are here today in 2017, and someone will probably be showing your movement in some sort of relevant way in a presentation, I believe, in 20 years. So I think that's really amazing. But understanding how important style is, you know, not superficial style, but authentic, true style that comes from you, from your culture, from where you're from, where your background. These are all things that I think are very important. And the merging of music and fashion, I think, is what it's all about. So American Crew, going back through the 90s, one of the things that we are very proud of as a company is the fact that, you know, if you took 20 guys and lined them up, 10 guys and lined them up 20 years ago and said to them, how many people here use hair product? You realize most of them would have said no one. that it's only 20 years, and now grooming products have become back to the same sort of regular use that they were in the 50s. In the 50s, my father got up every day, went to his bathroom, put a grooming product in his hair, put a side part in his hair, combed it, put a white shirt and a black tie on, and went to work. That was modus operandi in the 1950s. That'll never happen again. That isn't something that's coming with this regular grooming. What's happening now is men are they understand the power of style, the power of creating their own look, having their own sort of grooming as opposed to using unisex products. And I think that's an amazing place for us to be in style and fashion. So how does that relate to you in the music industry? Well, personal style is a big part of who you are and what you are. And we're not here to, of course, as a company, we're here to support your personal style. It's not that we're here to tell you what your personal style is. We just assist along the way. But understanding how important it is, you're merging fashion and with what you do, or creating fashion. I mean, if you look at what's come out of the streets, that's what mostly is considered fashionably today. So, that's where we're coming from at American Crew. A huge sort of melting pot of style and a historical place. But I just wanted to share that with you. So does anybody have any questions? I'd like to start with that.
I can jump in a bit.
Sure.
We can do a little impromptu interview, and then we can open it up. So, you guys are a pioneering brand in the sense that you're using music as a way to market a product. And I think for a lot of the students here, that's interesting, right? A lot of us who come to a music school, you don't necessarily think about partnering with a brand to get your music out there. You think of YouTube, you think of SoundCloud, you think of a traditional record label, but you have found that actually partnering with a musical brand, that's what Elvis does, is actually has big brand benefits. So I'm curious about the motivation there, and have you seen other successful collaborations between brands and music that you feel that's cool, that's authentic?
I have. When you think about music and the inspiration that everyone gets from it, people love musicians. They believe musicians. It's hard to figure out what is an authentic group to work with, to partner with. Musicians are authentic. You have to be a musician to say you're a musician. So when you partner with someone, obviously American Crew, if we did a feature with a musician, they would have to sing. They would have to play an instrument. If they're a dancer, they would have to dance. When you use a model or you use anyone in the sort of in a superficial way, there isn't the authenticity that comes with a performance. So, either the musician like Elvis, who had a past, we all knew he sang. We have plenty of opportunities to hear his music and see how he changed the world, or working with a new student. We would be, as we talk today, collaborating with new musicians and letting them sing and having us groom them or be part of their personal style is very interesting. I think it's the future. I think the collaboration between style and authenticity is the future.
Now, you're an artist yourself. Prior to becoming an entrepreneur and starting a company, you have been a very successful photographer. I'm just curious, how did that evolve? How did you make the journey from being an artist to being a business person? What motivated you to do that? Because a lot of the students here, they're what I'll call a hybrid. They're both an artist, but then they're all going out there aspiring to. They are startups. Ultimately, that's actually our message as an institute, that you as an artist are ultimately a startup.
Yeah, I see.
You want to create
a good way to look at it.
You want to create a career based on your unique strengths. And today, successful careers are rarely just in one field. So most musicians, they also, and Elvis was a prototypical multimedia star, but most musicians tend to excel on multiple media, including having a very particular style, if you will. But I'm just curious, from a personal standpoint, what motivated you to say, I'm going to make this transition from being an artist, a photographer?
I've never have transitioned out of it. So I still don't do what I do for money. Mm-hmm. It's more important now. It definitely calms the nerves. But when you think about it, I think back to when I was in my 20s, and I was very motivated by changing something. And I did grooming and chose grooming because I felt it was really important. And I felt that, I had to get up every day and work very, very hard at getting the male community to understand how important grooming is.
And why did you focus specifically on because this is interesting from a business standpoint, choosing your customer? And clearly you guys focused not on all sexes. You said, I'm just going to go after, men's grooming. Did you see a vacuum in the market that felt, okay, nobody else is doing this, so we're going to do this?
No, it wasn't that no one else was doing it. It was the importance of what it was at one time. Like part of my presentation, if you went back to the 50s and pre-Beatles in America, I was a hairdresser, so I was very into historical hair moments and things that changed the world on a hair basis. That was important to me. If you went back to prior to the Beatles, men groomed every day. It wasn't a blue-collar, white-collar thing. It wasn't a white, poor thing. It was a male thing. Mm-hmm. There wasn't a man who got up that didn't comb his hair, style his hair with a hair product, and then go attack the world. And then all hell broke loose in the 70s, and it took a long time to recover from that. So, I love cutting hair. That was a thing that I did at the time. That was my art. And I loved cutting men's hair. Cutting men's hair is very difficult. When you think back as a hairdresser, when you love the craft of barbering and you're going for meticulous barbering and now all this great stuff that's going on with fades and how precision hair cutting is very important to men, that was a blast. That was something I did. I was trying to hone my craft. So I did that, and I just sort of kept going with it until one day the world caught up. And it's like with music, somebody could keep playing a certain genre of music and loving it every day, and all of a sudden the world shifts to you. And that's kind of what happened with American Crew.
What I'm fascinated is the jump from urban black culture into mainstream suburban white culture in America. And you saw that with Elvis. As you said, that's how he styled himself, but clearly that was influenced from, the African American culture that was around him. But then today, fast forward 50 years later, 60 years later, it's still the same thing. You have this urban culture infiltrating and changing the way that stylistically people perceive themselves. So I guess if I were to try to look at the future of fashion, if I'm an artist coming today and I'm trying to express myself, when I was talking to Leor Cohen, who signed the Beastie Boys and Run DMC, he said, I want to go and see what these cool kids and what sneakers they're wearing, somewhere in the Bronx or Brooklyn, because that's the next major phase.
Absolutely.
Do you, as somebody who's observing sort of, fashion trends, would you agree with that statement that, this is sort of how, fashion
Absolutely.
proliferates?
The youth, I don't know about urban youth all the time, because I think urban youth's had a good run. Mm-hmm. I think but the youth will always be where change, happens in fashion or hair. They're at a time in their age and in their life that they can express themselves so much more. But right now, predicting hair, we've at American Crew, it's already like everything's out there right now. It's all on the table, which I think is so awesome. We have a, when I say that and anything goes, there isn't any pigeonholed sort of area that you can focus on. It's all there. which is great. I mean, if we were tomorrow to do a collection with longer hair, or we were tomorrow to do a collection with short hair, or whatever, there's an audience for it.
So my last question, I want to open it up. The tagline is music makes an artist, style makes an icon. There's a lot of amazing icons out there, people like Michael Jackson, Elvis, Muhammad Ali. I mean, the list is endless. What is it about somebody's personal style, right? I mean, Stevie Nicks, whatever, you name it, right? There's people who just stand out. So it's both their artistry, clearly their music that catches us. I mean, Michael Jackson, nobody can ever doubt the guy's talent, but he was also a stylistic icon when he came out, solo artist, late 70s, 80s. What is it? What do you think it is about a musician and the individual style that they have? And you threw a bunch of them up here that kind of makes them grab the popular imagination of people, and sometimes on both sexes, right? As a kid, I was just as much influenced by, the style of folks like Duran Duran, but, as a young male, I was into Madonna too, man.
Right, of course. Right.
So what is it about these musicians that gets them to stand out? Or like Chuck Berry just died. Clearly the guy had influenced Elvis very clearly, right? In the presentation, the look, Little Richard, Prince, another stylistic icon. What is it about them that makes them stick out?
It's funny, I met Adam Ant in the 80s in London, and he was obsessed with Prince. Like we were at a party, and I was talking to him, and all he wanted, he kept saying, and like everything. And when you look at his look, you can actually kind of see it. It wasn't overt or obvious, but he was very, very obsessed with Prince.
And Prince was kind of James Brown anyway.
Right, exactly. But he,
and Bruno Mars is Prince. It's kind of funny, right? How you see all this.
Yeah, it is cyclical, isn't it? It just keeps sort of going. I think back to trends and things that have influenced and infiltrated my community, which is very different than the music community. Understanding style and fashion. Michael Jordan was a huge influence on men's hair. White suburban youth shaved their head more during the period of Jordan's early years than in history, and he was responsible for that. That sort of, that became, the shaving of a part and all these little, the crossover. But again, to predict the next thing, we're living it right now. We're in the process of, that's the great thing about hair. I kind of mean this in a certain way. There isn't just one thing. It's like music as well. There's so many different genres to focus on. I don't know that that I even want to see one thing be. But for students that are trying to acquire a personal style, it's always better when it's incredibly authentic, when it comes from where you live, maybe some sort of cultural relevance to your neighborhood, to your ancestry. I think that shows, that kind of authenticity really shows.
By the way, I never thought of hair as genre up until you mentioned it. I think it's fascinating. They're just almost indistinguishable. The way that somebody looks and the music that they play is almost indistinguishable, right? We tend to think of music in images as well. You think of Elvis, you think of images. You think of jazz, you have a particular image. So photography, and that's your background as well, really shapes the way that we perceive music. I can't think of jazz without thinking of those iconic Blue Note images, from the 50s and the 60s. I can't think of 80s music without thinking of some of the stuff you showed. I can't think of 90s music. I can't think of hip hop without thinking of some iconic sort of look. But it's often something that I think in a music school we don't really teach, how to look in a certain way. We teach you how to sound a certain way, but the two are almost indistinguishable because how you look is as much of an expression of how you sound.
And you start a certain way. Look at Dylan as an example. I don't know what your feeling on Dylan is, but he literally wore the exact clothes as Woody Guthrie, same plaid shirt. He went back to, that was his musical inspiration. and then the world changed. And then you look at him through, if you follow him as somebody is that old, all the way through every one of these eras, he looked a lot like what was going on in every single genre. So, that part of it I think is interesting as well. I know it's very obsessional to kind of look at hair as a genre and understand, but truly from a grooming product standpoint and as a hairdresser, it's so important to know historically why, not just what it looked like or how to do it, but why. Why did the world jump on board to these and resonate to these looks? And that's what we look for a lot.
My last question around photography. So you took a lot of iconic photos of a lot of iconic people like Ray Charles and Yoko Ono and countless others. Who's the coolest person you ever photographed and why? Or who did you think?
My dad was the coolest person I ever photographed, I think. Tom Waits was the coolest person I ever photographed. You know this musician Tom Waits?
Of course.
He was so comfortable with himself and so pleasant. I have a kind of a strange story with it. I went to his home to photograph him, and I thought it was his home. It was his town, but it was a gas station address that he gave me, and he met me in his car. And unfortunately, I got a rent-a-car at the airport, and it was a yellow Aztec. Does anybody know what an Aztec looks like? They look like a little kind of a bear. It's the ugliest ugliest car ever made, and yellow on top of it. So he pulls up in this big black Suburban, and it was going to be a quick photo. And I found a place that when I was driving in, I saw this beautiful field. I thought that'd be a great place to shoot if we can go there. Anyway, he said to me, well, let's jump in your car. We'll take your car. And so I said, okay, this is my car. And he looked at it and he just stopped for a second. He shook his head. He's like, so they're naming them after Indians again. That was his comment, as opposed to saying how ugly the car was. But anyway, when I photographed him, you can just see how when somebody is truly cool, truly Tom Waits. Like Tom Waits lives as this boozy artist who has this sound and he really doesn't care and is very casual. That's Tom Waits. He's incredibly funny. When I finished really fast, he was like, "You're done? That's too quick. You want to shoot some more?" And it was just a really pleasant and wonderful experience. Plus, I think I was very happy with the photos. I mean, I got to shoot Ray Charles while he was playing the piano. I mean, I could barely compose the picture. He just sat there, and shooting someone who's blind is also a very interesting because they don't look at you. Or, he had to stop playing the piano and he just, for a second, he goes, "You there?" That's what he said. I thought that was pretty funny. I'm like, "Oh yeah, I'm here." I'm like, but I did because I wouldn't click until he stopped playing. I didn't want to interrupt, as a thing. But
how do you bring? You also shot a bunch of album covers. We were talking about this over lunch. How do you bring somebody's essence when you're shooting them? How do you capture? So a lot of the students here are artists, and even though the album photography is kind of sadly being reduced to this small that I almost never get to see unless I'm on my Sonos and my phone is showing me the album cover. But I mean, what do you focus on? Like if you were somebody in the audience who is interested in projecting a certain image, as a photographer, how do you capture that?
Well, the unfortunate thing,
or how do you style somebody for that matter?
I mean, I think in general, getting a wonderful picture of somebody is first. So, whether you are shooting for their gesture or their eye contact or what you're shooting for is very important. Like, it's very rare. I mean, the albums that I worked on, most of them, they were just pictures that I had shot of the artist that the label chose then for the album cover. It wasn't like we sat out where it would be wonderful to sit down, which I never have, sit down with an artist who was making an album who had a concept in their heart for what because somebody who's making an album knows what they want the album, especially a newer musician, they're going to be way more excited about the album cover. But I haven't had that opportunity. I did shoot Iggy Pop for an album cover, and we did set out to get a certain thing for the cover of the album. And it was very conceptual. It wasn't like I was trying to get it. The name of the album was Ready to Die, and Iggy strapped dynamite to his body.
Was he bare-chested again?
He was bare-chested.
I'm joking.
He was bare-chested.
He's always bare-chested.
Yeah, I think if I'm 70 and I look like that, I would take my shirt off too.
You'll walk around with a shirt off.
I'm 50 and I wouldn't do that. But he's also an artist who's, I don't know how compassionate he is about the album cover anymore. But I think as young musicians, I would be thrilled. That would be a fun project to work on, where you start by trying to distill why they made the record and make the album cover have some sense of speaking to that. I think the old album covers did that a lot. I mean, there's so many iconic, amazing album covers that you just would be going through if I was at the record store, I would stop and just look at them. And, there's a new documentary that just came out on the Wax Trax record label in Chicago. Do you know much about that?
I mean, I know the name.
Yeah, it's an 80s music scene in Chicago that was very punk and like Ministry and that kind of stuff. There were great album covers out of that time too. So that was another thing to watch for.
Well, and I've heard often music being described as painting with sound, right? And some of the most iconic artists out there tend, even especially with the invention of the multi-track recording, they started seeing themselves not just as live performance artists, but actually as painters who were using sonic imagery to some degree to create a particular vibe. I have a quick question from the audience. How many of you, I mean, most of us are a musician. How many of you actively think about your image as being a projection of your musical expression? Okay, but not all of you. That's interesting. Well, I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So any questions for David? Yeah.
With the success of the signature, like Elvis Presley grooming products line and all that stuff, have there been any plans of developing similar signature lines of products with other artists with like similar authenticity, like with Prince or Michael Jackson?
No, but it's a great idea. We just started this Elvis thing. Kind of came fast and furious, and we wanted to see how it goes. But that is a really good idea. I mean, it's music and hair are so but that could be very interesting. So there wasn't, but thank you. There is now. You got the marketing, got the head of marketing right behind you. She wrote that down.
The Revlon people are sitting right behind you, so you're giving them ideas. Any other questions? Yeah.
What do you find are some like specific aspects for like cohesive branding when it comes to like a specific artist? If you're working like a lot with them, if it's between like album covers or different photos or logos, is there like, do you try and stick to a specific color scheme or something like that?
It's a really great question, and it's an impossible one to like when you think about it. I don't do this very often, where I get in front of brilliant young people and talk to you about music, which I'm not a musician. But I started thinking about exactly what you just said, as Panos has told me about his entrepreneur class. And that's very important, your brand. And then I started thinking about like what I like in music and who I like in music. And I had to say that a lot of the music that I like and the brands that I like were authentic. So, and I've used that word 3 times.
Yeah, what does that word mean to you?
And that's why I want to, it means there's a reason, a purpose. It's, I'm from Chicago, okay? For me to make an album about Pittsburgh would be impossible. I could make a good album on Chicago conceptually. I know neighborhoods, I know people, I know cultures, I have something to say, I have a voice. So that starts first. That's authentic. Okay, now, how do I brand that? How would I brand my authentic whatever record that would be? And I mean, branding is important to me. It's what we do at American. We do a lot of having to brand a new concept, a new product every year. And I find the ones that are the most successful are the ones that didn't fall far from the tree. Like for American Crew to come out tomorrow with like a glitter brand of something would just be wrong. So for you, you would first sit down and look historically at what inspired you. See what kind of branding information that the past can give you. Then sit where you are in the present. Like think about why you did it, why you wrote the song, why you played it. Because in the present, you have to figure out who's going to listen currently, who's your audience. And then you want to go into the future a little. Can't go too far. People who go too far in the future are geniuses and they're visionaries. But if it's timing and finance has anything to do with timing or success, you can't go too far. I mean, being the best kept, like, I had the idea 20 years ago guy, doesn't get you anywhere. So, history, present, a slight future, where you'd like to be, and then think about why you did it or why you wrote it. Out of all that comes font. Like, you look back in the past at fonts from the I don't know, whatever. You know what I'm saying? If you just blend all that together, and then what color is, if you wrote words down that described what you came up with from history, present, and future, I think you'd end up with something really good. You'd probably have a start for sure.
Any other quick questions?
Yes.
So you were talking about how musicians can obviously talk about how they can market their style from their hair to their looks, their clothes, and music in general. So as a photographer, how can you really put your style out there and let people know hey, this is my style, this is my specific type of thing, and this is what I want to almost curate to the world as me being? Because obviously, musician, you can do it with your song and have specific chords, specific melodies, hair. But as a photographer and seeing how everybody nowadays can do it from the iPhone to professional camera, how can I curate that so it's my type of style and really put a style out there to let people know when they look at that, that's Sebastian, and that's my work in general?
That's a brilliant question.
It is, and you picked something, photography, which is currently in a very difficult time because the high-res cameras, the iPhones have made anybody have the ability to create something visually pretty compelling. However, that if what was important to you is I want to create a voice in photography, okay? You're going to have to do a body of work that's consistent. They flow into each other. Like, I'm a photographer. I jump all over the place. I shoot everything under the sun. I don't really have my own style because I don't really want one. To be very honest, I enjoy being moved by photography, and I like to try a lot of things. It's not how I made a living. I made a living in the hair business. If I was making a living in photography, the most important thing is the body of work that you're currently doing and showing. So for instance, if you picked a subject matter, like the neighborhood you grew up in, I'm just using this as an example because I can't think of anything else, and you really told a story about the elderly, the youth, the buildings, everything that you possibly could, and they all came together in 60 or 70 photos. That's what art directors look for. They hire you based on a consistent body of work, not one photo. One photo's lucky. 10 photos is more than lucky. It's talent. 60's a show in a gallery and a body of work. So that's what's important. You have to exceed, and it's not easy, but it's so doable. I mean, I look at beautiful work all the time. I'm obsessed with photography, so I'm always looking online at different photographers, different imagery, and there is so much good work being done off the iPhone that I'm still incredibly inspired. But that's the thing is, think about those images and how they flow together. There's a lot of good websites that you could look at. I'd have to email them to you, but before I leave, give me your card and I'll send you links of more examples of what I mean, because there's places you can go where people did little studies on different things that made them very successful. That's what ad agencies look for. A lot of times when ad agencies are hunting for photographers, they look for that authentic body of work that somebody did, and then they take that body of work and they think, okay, I'm going to add that to a Nike campaign, or I'm going to bring that to this campaign because I want that to feel. So that kind of.
It's an interesting point though, because I've thought a lot about photography, and just like 100 years ago, you need to be a professional photographer to take a picture, and today it's become, some of us will say, democratized, right? Everybody with an iPhone can take a photo and run it through an amazing filter and kind of fake my way to make it look good. The same is happening to music. I mean, the truth is that, music making is becoming more and more democratized. You still need to be much more specialized to some degree to be able to express yourself. But on your iPhone, there's a product called Garageband that's actually been designed largely by Berkeley graduates, in case you guys don't know that. But Garageband is it's almost as powerful a tool as your camera on your iPhone, but to make music. So I've thought a lot about, okay, what will make a musician stand out 10, 15, 20 years down the road when this is only going to get exacerbated, right? With technology becoming even better, that makes us all musicians. And I think is what you said, the concept of originality, of an original voice, an original way of expression, which is true almost across media, film, photography, music. I have to finish soon. So is there any other questions you guys and gals have?
Who's your favorite photographer? An iconic one.
Probably Richard Avedon, I would have to say. Most inspired me the most. I think his stepping out of fashion to do real projects and then stepping back in and taking that into fashion would make him my favorite for sure.
What's your favorite album cover?
I knew you were going to ask me that. I was trying to change the subject because too many. They kind of blend together. I'm trying to think of, I don't know. That's, you know what? It's been too far. I'm too far away from it now. But
I can make that one easier. Because we were talking about before. How when you are first starting, maybe you give a lot more thought into the album cover, and as your career moves on, you sort of become a little bit less interested in that or a little bit numb. Just going back to you as a kid, looking through those album covers, what were some of those first?
Jethro Tull.
Which one?
Thick as a Brick. It was a very strange record, and it was a big. I don't know if you remember the album cover, but it was a story that was fake about a kid who was supposed to be a genius, and it was this whole fake newspaper thing was beautifully graphically designed. But when I was a kid, that was my all-time favorite album cover. I hung it up in my room in 6th grade as a piece of art. So yes. I have a very diverse music background too in what I like. I like everything. So,
well, that's amazing, David. And I want to make sure that everybody knows that through a generous donation from American Crew, we're establishing a new scholarship that will go towards originality, which is something different for us at Berkeley. We want to be producing original voices. To your point, people whose music lasts 40 years from now and then beyond. And hopefully, we'll be welcoming David back in the fall as well for a lot more talks around the concept of integrating fashion and music. And then I want to remind everybody about two things. We have an amazing show tomorrow at the Performance Center where all your fellow students will be interpreting amazing Elvis Presley music. Don't look at it as old music. Look at it as a prelude to the future. And then tomorrow at 1, we have what I consider to be the greatest American music historian coming on campus, 1 o'clock at 1A, which is in the 1140 building. Peter Goralnik wrote some amazing books, 2 about Elvis, one called Last Train to Memphis and the other one called Curless Love. Wrote some great books about Stax Records from Memphis, about Sun. The newest one is about Sam Phillips and Sun Records, and all the amazing artists that they recorded, like Johnny Cash and Little Richard. I guarantee you'll be blown away. I saw Peter when I was actually a student speak at the Brookline Booksmith and blew me away. So do come at 1 o'clock tomorrow. And once again, David, thank you so much for being a great supporter
Thank you.
of Berkeley.
It's fun. Thanks a lot.